for now we have a pause. A truce is maybe a bit too much. A truce sounds like you're on the way to peace. I think we have a pause because the tariffs might come back. Irrespective of what happens after the pause, the tariffs already have their impact, and not just because of the level of tariffs, but also because of the atmosphere that it has created. The issue came up after the global financial crisis, and the agreement was that China would get a higher share as a result of its contribution to help resolve that global financial crisis. It did get a higher share, but it's about 6% of the total, both in IMF and the World Bank, and the proper share should be at least twice as high.
Welcome to Inside the China Room, your premier destination for insights into Chinese current events. I'm your host, Jiang Jiang. China and the United States announced in Geneva on May 12th a series of tariff modification measures aimed at easing trade tensions between the world's two largest economies. A joint statement said both sides recognize the importance of their bilateral economic and trade relationship to both countries and the global economy. What does the 90-day trade truce between China and the U.S. mean for both economies? How will trade relations between the two countries evolve after the 90-day period? Is there a possibility that tariffs could be reimposed? What impact does the trade war have on the global economic landscape? Join me to talk about the China-U.S. trade truce today is Bert Hofman. Bert is the former director of the East Asian Institute of the National University Singapore, NUS, and now professor at that institute. He was also a professor in practice at the Li Guangyao School of Public Policy of NUS. He is also a senior fellow at MERICS in Germany, non-resident senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and member of the World Association for China Studies. Before joining NUS, he worked with the World Bank for 27 years, 22 of which in Asia and 12 of which on China. Bert's current interests include China's future growth trajectory, technology, aging, and geopolitics, and China-U.S. relations. Bert also runs a Substack newsletter called Bert's Newsletter. Hi Bert, welcome to Inside the China Room.
Thanks for having me, Jiang Jiang.
Thank you. I'm really glad to have you on my show. I think it's just been over a month since we last met in China, and a lot of things has happened after that. Most notably, the trade truce between China and the United States. Many commentators have insisted on calling it a truce rather than an agreement. And I think that reflects the culture's tone around both the perception and the nature of the deal. So to start us off today, how do you see the fact that the two countries managed to reach a truce just about a month after the trade war escalated? Were you surprised by the timing and the content of the deal, especially the significant rollback of the previously imposed tariff?
Well, it's been quite a roller coaster, so one should not be surprised to be surprised. And I have to say that the truth and the scaling down of the tariffs, that the second part came as a surprise to me. The first part, less so. There were clear signals that already from the start, that Mr. Trump wanted negotiations with China. And then there were the annual meetings or the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, and there was some informal contact there, I believe. China's finance minister played a role there, and sent the Secretary of the Treasury from the US side played a role there. And so there was a little bit of rumbling that something was cooking. And then the Swiss, being very neutral, they had the smart idea of inviting both parties to Geneva. And both had business there, but the real business was, of course, to meet. And that went relatively well. So I would say for now we have a pause. A truce is maybe a bit too much. A truce sounds like you're on the way to peace. I think we have a pause because the tariffs might come back, as you suggested. And the tariffs are still there. Yes, we dialed down from 145% on China's export to the U.S. and 125 reciprocal tariffs from China on exports from the U.S. The tariffs now are still high. If you add it all up, China is still facing something in the order of 40% on average tariffs, and that is not trivial at all. So we do have quite some barriers for China's export to the United States. And depending on the sector, some sectors are really high, such as steel and aluminum. Auto parts, autos are really high. And then you have the fentanyl tariff. Don't quite understand it, but the fentanyl tariff, which is 20%. And you have the base reciprocal tariffs of 10%. And of course, even before Trump 2, there were tariffs on China's exports to the United States, something in the order of 13, 14%. So if you add it all up, you still end up with quite a bit of tariffs now. So it is a pause, and we've come down from what the Ministry of Commerce in China named ridiculous levels of tariffs, but there's still significant tariffs. And the question is what will happen after the pause runs out early August.
We'll touch on that a little bit later. So you just mentioned that the tariffs has been reduced, but there is still a certain amount of tariffs on like products from the both sides. So based on the current pause of the tariffs policy, what's your take on these pauses' potential impact on the China's economy and the U.S. economies?
Well, irrespective of what happens after the pause, the tariffs already have their impact. And not just because of the level of impact, the level of tariffs, but also because of the atmosphere that it has created. Talking about the impact of the tariffs themselves, you saw in China's April trade numbers, you already saw some impact. And you saw actually that China's exports continue to be relatively healthy, but that there's been a major diversion of trade away from the United States. A lot to Southeast Asia, to ASEAN, and quite a bit to Europe. So you see China's companies, they can't deal with the uncertainty, and they're trying to shy away from the United States and trying to find other outlets for their products. They found them in Southeast Asia and they found them in Europe. Mind you, some of that is most likely to be transit trade, especially in ASEAN. We saw under Trump 1 and the tariffs that were introduced that suddenly Vietnam was started to export a lot to the United States. Thailand started to export a lot to the United States. Mexico started to export a lot more to the United States, but China was also exporting a lot to those countries, to Vietnam, to Thailand, to Mexico. So that was really transit trade, if you want. It was really Chinese exports, but it was diverted through third countries to avoid the tariffs. I think you see some of that now, but I also think it won't last. Those countries themselves, because they run surpluses with the United States, they are hit by reciprocal tariffs themselves. Therefore, that transit trade game, if what China has played under Trump 1, is unlikely to last under Trump 2. But more general, let's take one step back. I mean, the way the Trump administration is going about imposing these tariffs unilaterally without any basis in the WTO, but based on sometimes archaic national laws, calling in emergencies that give the president a lot of power to impose those tariffs without consulting Congress, a way of doing business that is fundamentally changing the international order. There's a lot of uncertainty because there's not one voice from the Trump administration. Mr. Trump himself cares a lot about bilateral trade deficits, bilateral trade balances. There's not an economist in the world that cares about that, but Mr. Trump cares about that. But then there is extremists like his advisor Navarro, who likes to see a much more autarkic United States, so wants to onshore all of the business and doesn't even want foreign investment in the United States, so doesn't want any dependence. Then there is people like the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisor, Miran, who sees the dollar as the centrality in the system and appreciate the dollar as the main culprit in the game. And so they try to weaken the position of the dollar and maybe make something of a big accord, such as the Plaza Accord in the past, and it would be the Mar-a-Lago Accord. And then there is the best sense of the world and the Angria, the trade representative. If you want, they're the grown-ups in the room. They see that they can tweak a little bit the international supply chains and maybe onshore a little bit of business to the United States, but not fundamentally changing the international order. So there's a lot of noise in there because we don't quite know where it's going to end up. And Mr. Trump seems to be very taken by whoever gave him the last advice and then might change his mind. So that brings a lot of uncertainty. What it does mean for, and not just for China, but it means for many countries that the United States simply becomes a less reliable partner in trade and investment, but also in future is likely to play a less prominent role in conserving and setting the rules for the international order, because the United States seems to be much less interested in that than some other countries, including the EU and including China. Both see multilateralism still as the basis for the international order. So there's a lot going on and a lot of uncertainty right now in the system. That uncertainty by itself, and which is reflected in the indicators we have for policy uncertainty, and they're really through the roof. Trade policy uncertainty is at unprecedented levels. Ever since it was measured in the early 80s, it has never been this high. But more general policy uncertainty in the world is very high. Now, that by itself has its effect as well, because a lot of companies need to make a decision on where to invest, how much to invest. And frankly, if you're potentially hit by a tariff overnight that could wipe out your business, you don't make that decision. You wait until the dust is settled. And that just waiting for the dust to settle by itself has a negative effect on economic activity. Second, there's a lot of consumers, particularly in the United States, a lot of consumers that are hit by all this noise. They're hit by a decline in the stock market that they've seen. So their pension savings are affected, and they're dialing back on consumption because they fear that things might get worse, and therefore they become more careful. So that the uncertainty by itself already has this economic effect. And you saw the first quarter data for the United States, they actually showed a slight decline in economic growth for the United States as a result of that uncertainty.
Yeah, I think what you have mentioned a lot is about like the short-term disruptions to both the U.S. consumers' confidence and also like ASEAN or other regional places or countries, their supply chains and their connections with globalizations. We know that it's like a policy launched by the new U.S. administration. And every U.S. administration has like a 4-year term. Because you mentioned about uncertainties, what would be your observation from a long-term perspective? The trade war happened and that's impact on global decision makers' minds, because I believe that it seems very hard for every country just to localize the whole supply chain domestically. On the other side, globalization improved the efficiency of lots of countries. But now everybody is going to learn a lesson from this trade war. So from a long-term perspective, what will be the impact on the global supply chain?
Well, I think everybody is trying to figure this out, and we're not there yet. I wrote a piece in my newsletter that you kindly refer to, which is called The Committee to Save the Rest of the World, under the assumption that the United States will simply play a less prominent role by choice in the international economic order, and that the rest of the world would have to figure it out how to then continue that international order without that prominence of the United States. And one can think about different structures emerging. They can be regional or they can still be global minus the United States, but that's still up in the air. So how that long-term international order is going to look like is still quite hard. In the short term, though, the tensions are not insignificant, because one of the things that we saw is indeed this diversion of exports by Chinese exporters to other parts of the world. And that creates tensions. Already, China also ran surpluses with those countries, and the diversion of the exports that previously went to the United States, now to Europe, now to ASEAN, that creates additional tensions. I believe that there's a solution to be had, and rather than everybody imposing tariffs on everybody, and that would need to be managed and that would need to be agreed on. That's why it's promising to see talks among regional leaders or even among the EU and China. The EU and Britain have become friends again after Brexit, because there is a totally new situation on the international trade order. So you see new structures emerging that would, in my view, determine the shape of supply chains over time. Of course, the issue is a little bit bigger, especially for Europe. The security issue is really very big. because the United States has expressed that they would be less interested in NATO and that Europe should basically take care of itself. Over time, that may not be a problem, but in the short run, it's a real problem. And there is a war going on in Europe, the Ukraine, and that is a real problem for the whole of Europe. So they have additional problems in the security sphere where they still need the United States, at least for the medium term, and that may influence their stance on trade and investment and this international order. So those are difficult issues to think through, but I think the conclusion in the end is that we will have stronger regional structures with hopefully some preservation of the global system, which in trade is represented really by the WTO. The WTO was not functioning very well because the core mechanism of the WTO is their arbitration system, i.e. countries can complain about other countries if they feel that they are doing something against the rules. But the highest court in judgment, the arbitration panel, the appellate body there, is not functioning simply because the United States has blocked appointments of appellate body judges already for ever since the Obama administration. So that route is no longer functioning very well. There's been some alternative education mechanisms that have been set up, and maybe that will prevail over time as being an alternative to the WTO, or maybe even something supported by the WTO as an organization that will keep most of the system together.
Let's shift to strategy. China responded to US tariff hikes with direct counter tariffs and other forms of retaliation without showing much sign of backing down. While the two sides eventually reached a trade truce, the US is now also engaging in tariff-related negotiations with other countries, including European countries, EU. Do you think China's approach might set an example? For instance, what will EU do in response to President Trump's suggesting a straight 50% tariff on the EU? Could we see more countries choosing not to compromise, but instead push back against US pressure more assertively?
Well, Zhang, the 50% has already been dropped again because there was a pause until July. It all cancels then. It's paused again. Look, this is all very confusing. The EU, of course, has announced that it would retaliate. It hasn't retaliated because the tariffs were not imposed yet. Remember, there was an announcement on April 2nd of the tariffs. China said, okay, well, we'll retaliate. The EU said, if this is going to be imposed, we will also retaliate and we'll tell you what the retaliation is going to be. They didn't specifically say what they were going to retaliate with. Since then, the EU has made a list of retaliation which they would hit, and that includes soy and corn from the United States and bourbon and other stuff, adding up to a fair amount of export from the United States to Europe. I believe that they made clear that they would impose tariffs. That not as tough as China, but nevertheless a very assertive stance. But a lot of countries, they are not strong enough by themselves to actually do something. The ASEAN example is really interesting. They haven't said anything yet, but what they have said is that they would act as a united entity. They would act as an ASEAN in response. And that is a huge step for ASEAN because even though they are an economic unity, they've never been as close as they are now under the threat of the Trump tariff. So after the pause, and the pause for countries outside China, they end on July 9, I believe. We'll see what that means. But other individual countries, they try to make a deal because they don't have as much bargaining power as, say, a China or an EU. I mean, the EU is now the largest trade partner for the United States, and so they would have significant leverage over the United States, and they're ready to use it. That's what they've said. So I believe that China was the first to announce a tough stance on Mr. Trump's announcements of tariffs, but it's not the only one, and smaller countries simply, they don't have enough leverage, or they just try to make a deal.
So let's talk about China-U.S. So how will trade relations between China and U.S. evolve after the 90-day period? From a long-term perspective, do you think China and U.S. trade will continue to decouple, or will it stabilize within a certain trade volume range for quite some time?
Well, if you look historically, of course, China and the US, they have been decoupling. And notably, China has been decoupling from the US. People seem to forget that, but China's import share from the US went from more than 30% to now less than 15%. Same on exports, it went from over 30% to 14% now. And yes, there's a bit of trade diversion, so it's probably the real number is a bit higher. But China now depends far less on the United States, both for its imports and for its exports. The United States more recently has started to decouple. And well, it started under Trump 1, where the import share of China in the US imports started to decline. But then there was COVID and it bounced up again. And now it has found, if you want, another declining trend that, in my view, will persist, irrespective of what comes out specifically in terms of agreement, and whether we have that in August or whether we have that later, but still assume that there will be some sort of an agreement. But for investors and for exporters, it is simply too risky to count on the United States as a market, because everything may be different overnight depending on what side of the bed the president wakes up. So I believe that that is a strong impetus for Chinese exporters to find different markets, even irrespective of the tariffs that will come out. So there will be more decoupling and there will be less intense trade exchange. Of course, from the United States, the few things that the US is really good at is especially in the technology sphere, where still the United States has the most cutting edge technology in the world, and especially in chips, but in a number of other areas as well. But sanctions prevent the United States companies from exporting those to China. So those companies will have to find different markets because China is no longer possible. And that is much more of a strategic choice, if you want, a national security driven move that I find is very hard to turn around at this point.
If we don't consider the politics factors, do you think the structure of the US economy and the China's economic structure kind of complement each other, like a good match for each other? Because US is like a big consumer market and China has a big population. I mean, they used to work very well together, right? What's your evaluation on the current situation?
They used to complement each other perfectly, and particularly under the heydays of globalization after China's entry in the WTO, what you saw was a lot of outsourcing of US companies to China, and Apple is still, if you want, the poster boy for that. A lot of the apples are produced in China, but under assignment of Apple. And then the United States was the consumer of last resort in the world. Partially this is changing because the United States and China are becoming more similar. China has been catching up in a whole range of areas, becoming more and more high tech in its own production structure. So the competition with the production structure in the United States is becoming more direct. The benefits of outsourcing to China are leveling off. I don't say they're declining, but they're leveling off. I think a lot of the gains that have been had, and now a lot of companies are looking for a China plus one, or looking even for diversifying out of China, in part because of the trade war, but also because of cost structures are changing in China. The labor force is declining. The environmental costs are increasing. Land is harder to get in the industrial center. So people are looking around to see whether there are alternatives or not. And that is because of the catching up of China, if you want. So very similar countries, they have less to trade because they are so similar. And you see a little bit of that starting to happen between the US and China, and to some extent between China and the EU, becoming more and more similar. 5 years ago, Chinese cars were no competition for German cars. Now they are. And the similarities and the direct competition is a bigger theme at this point. Over time, that may or may not result in less trade. I mean, as an economist, you would say the more the merrier, because China can produce different variations, especially EVs, but all kinds of different cars. That's great to have 10 different new cars from China. I just bought a Chinese car, I have to say, a Danza, the first electric van that is on the market here. And before there was a Toyota because those were the best vans for the family. Now I can actually buy an electric one. So that's additional choice for me, and that means more welfare for people. And China produces them at relatively limited cost. That effect is, of course, positive. But politicians think differently. They think, oh, this is going to cost us jobs. And to some extent, that is correct. That some people that used to work in the car industry in Japan or in Europe, they will have to find different things to do. And it's up to governments to help those people move to new occupations. Europe is better at that than the United States. Europe, remember the China shock of the 2000s? That was in particularly a US phenomenon. And that's in part because the US spends less money to help people move from one job to the next. It's called direct labor market interventions. Europeans do quite a bit of that. And that's why this China shock in Europe was far less severe than it was in the United States. But that will happen again. And now more in the core of manufacturing in Europe, and they will have to find an approach. I repeat it again, but it is important to realize. One complication of that is national security. 20 years ago, I think we didn't have the national security concern, or 30 years ago when China joined the WTO, and it was all enriching and more choice and lower production costs. Now it is also, well, we still need to be able to produce stuff, because if we don't produce stuff anymore, we can't defend ourselves anymore. And there's a clear move towards more defense spending in Europe to an industrial policy produced last year, September or October. The Draghi report has set out that, look, the defense industry can be a strategic pillar for Europe around which it can upgrade its research and development, around which it can maintain its industrial base. And why is that? Because Russia is a renewed threat to Europe. We all thought that we were done with that, but now that is back on the table. That complicates trade arrangements. It's the one thing that economists have nothing to say about, because if national security is at stake, literally according to the WTO rules, then countries can take care of their own national security, and they can take the trade measures that would match that. That's not unlimited, but there is a certain amount of freedom to impose trade rules because of national security.
So it's not just like a concern for China to prioritize security or development. It's actually a global issue for lots of places.
Yes, and I think most countries are late to the game. China recognized this fairly early on. I think the national security played a bigger role, and the rule of not to depend on other countries for critical inputs became, if you want, a guide for industrial policy in China. A lot of people say China militarized trade, but in a way it's very logical. In a way it was far-sighted, because China knew that it was going to be increasingly dominant in the world, and that many countries would see it as a threat, including the current hegemon, the United States, and they saw that national security was going to be an issue. So they were in a way ahead of the game. Now there is more countries that realize that national security is an issue, and that complicates trade relations. But frankly, to make all trade dependent on national security doesn't make any sense. So you could say, okay, well, there is some areas, and Biden, I know the Chinese didn't like it, but Biden's policy of small yards with high fences is actually the approach, where you say, okay, so there's a couple of areas where we really have to focus on, and that is national security. Just like China focuses on critical inputs and critical dependencies that it wants to avoid, that's national security, but the rest should still be market economy. The rest should still be subject to the freest trade rules possible.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, it's fair for every country decision maker to defend its national interests. On the other side, we are really experiencing unforeseen changes in a century. So I think that sets the tone for lots of conversations today. Before we move to the recommendation session, I would like to ask you about the international institutions like the World Bank. I mean, given the growing pushback against multilateralism in recent years, what role do you think organizations like the WTO, the World Bank, and the regional trade blocs playing in the global trade system going forward? What should they do, or what will their role be changed in the coming years?
Well, let me first state, so you gave this great saying of change is not seen in a century, but I always like to quote Lenin, who allegedly said that, there's decades in which nothing happens, and then there is weeks in which decades happen. And I think we are in those weeks in which decades happen. So there's a lot of change, including around the position of international organizations. And Mr. Trump has already ordered to step out of the World Health Organization, left the Paris Agreement on climate change, and he has ordered a review of U.S. engagement in every international organization, including World Bank and IMF. And there is a plan, which Mr. Trump said is not his plan, but he seems to be reading from that book. There's a plan which is called Project 2025, which basically is the shadow plan for the Trump administration. And that actually includes the United States stepping out of even World Bank and IMF to minimize the international entanglement of the United States. So a very isolationist view is expressed in that plan. We're going to get early August, we're going to get the result of that review, and then we're going to see what the United States is planning. Mr. Besant, the Secretary of the Treasury, who is overseeing both the U.S. engagement in the IMF as well as in the World Bank, he said, no, we don't want to leave as long as the IMF and the World Bank implement the U.S. MAGA agenda. Now, that's a bit hard because it's an international organization. There's many stakeholders, there's many shareholders. So how to find a compromise between that remains to be seen. Look, these are two organizations, and I think the IMF a bit more than the World Bank, but that help shape the international order, that help shape especially the monetary order, and which is a precondition for free trade, if you want. They may change a little bit in their approach to some of those questions. But central to all of this is still the WTO. And the WTO organization is a very small organization, and it really serves its members. So it really has to be the members that all agree on new directions in the trade organization. The United States, by appealing to all of its domestic laws, has clearly put itself outside the framework of the WTO as it exists. And as it has existed since 1948, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which the United States basically designed. So this is an odd situation where we have the architect of the system basically stepping out of the system. What the United States wants with the WTO remains unclear. I mentioned before that the WTO system, i.e., through complaints, through arbitration, through appeals, through a final judgment, through the appellate body, is at the moment broken. High time that something alternative would develop, and either with or without the United States. And I think there's enough sensible countries in the world to find that. But then you would have, if you wanted, the WTO rules without the United States. Coming back to World Bank and IMF, they had a problem. They're a shareholding organization, and the shareholding is more or less commensurate, and it's a little vague in their articles of agreement, but it's basically, it should be commensurate with the role of the countries in the world economy. And the bottom line is that China, and to some extent India, but not that many other countries, but they need a much larger shareholding of World Bank and IMF. That has been held back for years now. The issue came up after the global financial crisis, and the agreement was that China would get a higher share as a result of its contribution to help resolve that global financial crisis. It did get a higher share, but it's about 6% of the total, both in IMF and the World Bank. And the proper share should be at least twice as high. So we have an issue there in governance. If the United States were to step out of the World Bank and IMF, that of course that would be a blow. Don't let me not be facetious about that. It would be a blow because the United States is a big contributor, especially to the World Bank, especially to the low-income organization, IDA, the International Development Organization, which is a grant-based organization. So every 3-4 years, IDA has to go around with the hat for contributions. And the United States is a very big contributor. That would fall away if the United States were to step away. But on the shareholding side, it would make things a lot easier because suddenly there would be 15% of shares in both organizations. They would be available for redistribution, and you could then reorganize the shareholdership such that China, India, but also Brazil and others would get their rightful share in the organization without affecting the incumbents, because frankly, it's especially the Europeans. I am European, so apologies for that, but especially the Europeans that are holding back, and to some extent Japan, that are holding back this readjustment because it would go at the expense of Europe and Japan. So a lot of things up in the air. Next month in August, we will get the report of the United States, what they want with the international organizations, and then we can find out more. I believe there is people around the world that are starting to think about, well, what would happen, what if, and what would happen, and how can we design structures that would maintain the benefits of globalization, would maintain the benefits of free trade, even without the architect in the room. And of course, the regional agreements are undoubtedly going to play a bigger role, in my view. Asia, for that matter, is pretty well positioned. They have the China-ASEAN free trade. Because of all the noise around the U.S. tariffs, there's actually a version 3 now, and that provides even more space for cooperation. But there's RCEP. There is, for the somewhat more sophisticated rules, as CPTPP, and China aspires to join the CPTPP, which is all positive. But Europe by itself, of course, is also a very strong, pretty well integrated economic sphere. If you take the EU and then the European Economic Association together, so the Nordics and some others, and Britain is part of that, that is a very strong economic base, and they would probably do quite well on their own. A country that has less trade and investment links in its own continent is actually the United States. Beyond the USMCA, or formerly the NAFTA, there is far less linkages, supply chain linkages across the American continent. And that, in a more divided world, would be a weakness for the United States as compared to Asia and Europe.
What about the African countries? I mean, are their economies being disrupted more like seriously or less impacted by the global disorder?
At the moment, it is less. And there's one big threat, that if everybody goes back to their own island, would there ever be a linkage of Africa with global supply chains? In the past 2 decades, particularly China has been very good in creating ties with Africa, first on natural resources and infrastructure, but now increasingly on manufacturing. And has been a big support for many African countries. Europe has been very good to African countries, but much more in terms of aid and development assistance, far less in trade. This could be a moment where you'd say, and it would make perfect sense, of course, geographically, that Europe would reach out more to Africa, that European companies would find more opportunities in Africa. It also works out well because demographically, Africa is the one continent where aging and demographic decline is not yet an issue, and probably won't be an issue for the next decades, at least until the end of the century. So there are real opportunities for African countries as well. I think China, again, is ahead. They've been quite visionary there, but Europe can probably catch up in a number of spheres. The one threat for Africa and African development, or development more broader, is how technological development is going to play out. And there is a fear that robotization and artificial intelligence and all of the fancy stuff is actually going to make it very hard to link in global supply chains as a sort of a starting country that has very little manufacturing experience. I think it's an open question at this point, but a lot of countries and decision makers in those countries, they are worried about that.
Thank you for all the insightful analysis, Bert. Now let's move to our recommendation session. We invite every guest of our podcast to recommend something to our listeners. It can be a book, a movie, TV series, or even a video game. What do you want to recommend to my listeners today?
Well, I want to recommend a very new book, and it's a book by Edward Luce. The book is called Zbig, so Z and Big, but it's about Brzezinski. Brzezinski was the national security advisor to Carter but he played a big role in designing the national security approach of the Carter administration, but also beyond that. And it's a wonderful book. It harks back to the days of the 1950s and 60s. He's Polish by birth, so he goes all the way back to pre-war Poland, pre-Second World War Poland, on how he personally develops, but then also how he helps shape the U.S. approach in the Cold War. And interestingly enough, where his big intellectual opponent, not his personal opponent, but his intellectual opponent, was Henry Kissinger, who is very celebrated in China, of course, and rightfully so, because he was, if you want, the architect of reaching out to China. But Brzezinski had done the same in designing the approach of reaching out to Eastern European countries, reaching out to the nationalities in the Soviet Union, which in the end undermined the Soviet Union in such a way that the United States won the Cold War. In any case, it's a lovely biography, wonderfully written, wonderfully researched, and I can recommend it to anybody.
Thank you. I will put the link of the book in my podcast, and I will definitely also try to read that. It sounds like a very fascinating book. Thank you so much for the recommendation. Thank you, Bert. Thank you very much for taking your time to come into my show. I think we have a great discussion today, and I hope our listeners can learn more about the China-U.S. trade relations from you. Well, I hope I can talk to you soon again in the future, and have a great day. Thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Inside the China Room podcast. For cooperation, investing, or feedback, you can email me directly at jjiang.sisu@hotmail.com. Alternatively, please consider leaving a rating and a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or Substack. If you find our podcast helpful, we would be delighted if you recommend it to others. See you next time and take care.